Well, hello. I'm so glad to be here today. And what I'm going to be showing you is some brand new material that I think you might find very, very helpful for your teaching. And this relates to how practice can build your hidden learning system. So I'll just give you a little bit of insight of what we're going to build towards. So your brain deposits sort of sets of links in long-term memory in two different systems. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about, don't worry, because we will soon cover all of this. First system is declarative. The second system is procedural. Well, what am I really talking about here? Let's start at the beginning. So the brain, as you probably know, is pretty complicated, but it has a fundamental set of building blocks, and those are, of course, your neurons. And there's about 86 billion neurons, give or take 5 billion or so, in your brain. And I know what you're thinking is, Course Hero, why are you doing this to us? She's going to give us this super long and incredibly boring talk about science. So let's spice it up a little bit with a metaphor for a neuron, and that is a space alien. So neurons have, they have these sort of leg things, and those are analogous to dendrites on a real neuron. And a space alien also has like these little toes, lots of knobs coming off their neurons, or the dendrites, and those are dendritic spines. And then a space alien has this arm that comes out of its head, and that's analogous in a real neuron to the axon that reaches out. And so what neurons actually do in your brain is they just love to reach out with their arm and they tickle the toe of an adjoining neuron. That's pretty much what they do. So when you're thinking about something, what's actually going on is your neurons are sending a signal that goes and jumps across that little gap called the synapse, and it goes across to the next neuron. It is more complicated than that. I will acknowledge you've got an electrical signal, and the electrical signal hops the gap as neurotransmitters and then goes on to the next neuron. But as far as we're concerned, we can just think of it as neurons send electrical signals. And when your students learn anything, what they're actually doing is simply creating a set of connections between neurons in your brain. So that's whether you're learning that a word in a foreign language, or you're learning how to take a derivative in mathematics, or a dance step, or whatever you're learning, you're actually just creating sets of connections between neurons. So I show 5 neurons here, but in reality, it's probably more like hundreds or even thousands of connections that are being made between neurons when you're learning something new. And especially quite a few neuron connections if you're learning something that's rather complex. So as you practice, or as you have your students practice, what's happening is they are building and strengthening the sets of links between those neurons. So as you're learning something, it's kind of like you're creating these sets of links, and you are practicing to strengthen those sets of links and also bring in other neurons. So you have a broader set of connections with whatever you're learning. If you, for example, learn something and then don't do anything with it for a couple of weeks, like students do oftentimes nowadays, what happens is, unfortunately, those neural connections that don't get used, they can be swept away by your little synaptic janitor. So that's why it's very important to learn and practice with what you're using or learning. And more important than that is you want to learn something during the day, and then you want to sleep. Because sleep, as it turns out, what's happening is you're having these little neuron or these dendritic spines pop out. But it's when you go to sleep that your brain sends these practicing signals again and again, hundreds of times through the night, that helps you consolidate and really get those strengthened connections. So we can see that here with a light microscopy image. This is an image of a living neuron before learning and before sleep. And this is the same exact living neuron after learning and after sleep. And wherever there's a blue triangle, you can see there's kind of a new dendritic spine that's either emerged or strengthened, and that's hooking in with another neuron. So it's the sleep process that is critical for really beginning to learn something well, to consolidate that information. Of course, this means it's much better to space out learning. If your students have 5 hours to learn, then you might have them do an hour or so each day, because they're not only getting those sets of links during the day, but they're strengthening them through the night as they're sleeping. And that means they're getting sort of a double hit on whatever they're learning, a double set of strengthening. If they just cram everything like 5 hours in one day, they're not getting all that enhancement each day through sleep. And their little synaptic janitors can sweep those patterns away much more easily. So that's why students can sometimes cram, do okay for an exam, but 3 days later, they've completely forgotten the material because they didn't sleep on it and develop it gradually. Good learning is like building a good wall. You lay the layer of bricks, lay the mortar, the bricks, but before you go too high, you let things dry. You let it take time. If you don't do that, you have a very poor foundation for learning. So I like to say that it takes time, just like this weightlifter did not sit and cram the night before a big test or a big competition. It takes time to build that muscular structure. In fact, muscles and neurons, they're both excitable tissues. So when I say that it takes time for this fellow to develop muscular structure, and that's analogous to the time it takes to develop neural structure, that's sometimes sort of irreverently called the meathead theory of brain function, but it actually works. So just remember, even though you can't see inside your brain, it's going to take time to develop these kinds of structures. Now, I do want to have just a little bit of a quiz for you to see what is the most powerful technique to help you learn most efficiently. Is it rereading or highlighting or underlining, retrieval practice, or is it creating a concept map? So you're seeing all the connections. And I'm hoping, Chris, that you might be able to run the survey, the poll at this time. Chris, you there? Yes, I hope. Oh, I'm getting a secret message on the side channel here. So let's see. Oh, okay. So we have a poll problem. So hopefully you have it in mind, whatever your answer is. So you got it? And here is the real answer. The answer is retrieval practice. So if you look, why would it be retrieval practice? What's happening is when, for example, right now, I'm giving you some information, and your brain is storing that in it's like making some connections in long-term memory, but they're pretty weak. And so what happens is every time you think about, now, what did she say? In other words, you retrieve that information from your own memory. Well, you retrieve it, look at how it strengthens that, and retrieve it again, strengthens more, retrieve it again. Each time you pull it from your own memory, you are actually strengthening those neural connections. But you might say, well, yeah, but that just means you're memorizing it. Not at all. Because what you're doing is you're teaching your brain, what is this concept? What is this concept not? And so it turns out that retrieval practice not only helps you remember the concept, but it actually helps you learn and understand that concept much more deeply. And this was all related in a wonderful set of articles in Science by Jeff Karpicki. And if you would like, feel free to read Jeff Karpicki's article, The Rebuttal from the Concept Mapping People Who Said that Jeff Karpicki didn't teach concept mapping appropriately, and then read Jeff Karpicki's rebuttal to that, and it's all quite fascinating. But in any case, the most important thing you can have students do is retrieve that information. But there's some other important things you can do that can help even more. So that's what we're actually going to get into right now with our news flash related to the fact that the brain deposits those sets of links in two different systems. So what do I mean by that? As it turns out, when you are, for example, right now, I'm explaining some information to you. And what is happening is you have, well, all this yellow stuff right here is actually, that's your neocortex. And so what I'm going to be talking about momentarily is your declarative memory system. Neocortex is like this big, it's like the bulk of your brain. It's actually a thin little layer of cortex, but that's where you store all those links of long-term memory. And your working memory, which is where you're holding ideas temporarily, is, well, first of all, it's sort of in your prefrontal cortex. So it's right in the front of your brain. That's where you're holding and working with information. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. And what happens is your hippocampus is this central area of your brain. And when you're learning something like right now, where I'm explaining very straightforwardly what's going on, well, hopefully straightforwardly, what's happening is information is going from your working memory through your hippocampus into your neocortex, and it's creating some faint sets of links there. But there's that other linking system or way that you could put links in your long-term memory. And that is to use your procedural learning system. So what is your procedural learning system? Turns out it doesn't even go through your working memory. You're not even conscious of it. You'll get some information, and what happens is it goes through your basal ganglia to create sets of links. I know what you're probably thinking, what's she talking about? But these are the kinds of things, like if I asked you, how do you ride a bicycle? A lot of that information about how you ride a bicycle, you can't explain it to me. And it's because you've learned it through your procedural system. Or let's say I asked you, explain to me how to tie your shoes. You would almost inevitably, even though that's very simple, you'd kind of resort to, well, let me just show you. because it's actually a really complicated procedure. So you're learning those kinds of things through procedural learning systems. But it turns out we've always known that relates to motor skills, procedural, and to habits. But it also turns out that procedural learning is very important for learning in general. And in fact, you learn through both your declarative and your procedural systems when you're learning things. So let's put them both together so you can kind of see what I'm really talking about. You've got declarative system, goes through the hippocampus, deposits links. Procedural goes through the basal ganglia and deposits links. So those are the two major ways that your brain can get information into long-term memory. And they often learn the same sorts of information, but they learn them quite differently. So it's like you need both legs to stand and move forward. And in your learning, you often need both declarative and procedural sets of information or sets of links in order to really understand information very, very well. So what let me try to describe to you some of the differences between these two different ways that you learn. Now, young people, like toddlers and infants, they often have a very strong procedural system. So this, in fact, is the way they learn their mother tongue. So procedural learning can actually be very complex. It can help you learn entire languages. When you know how to solve a Rubik's Cube very quickly, you've learned through your procedural learning system. It's for very complex sorts of things as well as simple sorts of things. Declarative learning is more like I explain it, it's very straightforward. You're very conscious of what you're learning. Procedural, you're not conscious. So, for example, let's say you live in a new apartment and you drive home from work, and you drive home from work every day for a year, and you really get to know, or even a couple months, you get to know exactly what to turn to take and so forth. In fact, what can happen is you can be thinking about something that really occupies your working memory, and you can drive home and not even be aware of it. How is that? You're using your procedural learning system, or that you use the sets of links you've deposited procedurally. So first you learn how to drive home declaratively. The more you practice and do it, the more it becomes something that is so second nature that you can do it without thinking about it. And that's when your procedural system has really learned it. Declarative learning grows through explicit instruction. Boom, 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 I tell you this, and then you do that. Procedural, it develops more through practice, where the brain detects these patterns in its subconscious or non-conscious. Spaced repetition is a very good way to develop your procedural learning sets of links. Also, interleaving. So, for example, you start with, usually teachers follow textbooks. They'll give you chapter 3 materials, chapter 4 materials, chapter 5 materials. With interleaving, you mix up chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5 kinds of problems or materials so that students don't just get used to using one technique, but they get used to selecting which technique is appropriate. And this is all facilitated through practice that helps build those procedural sets of links in long-term memory. For declarative learning, you can explain it. So they often say, well, you can't understand it unless you can explain it. It's not really quite true, because what you've learned procedurally, you sometimes simply can't explain, but you do know it and you're able to do it. So sometimes I think in grade school, for example, some kids are disenfranchised because they learn math more and better procedurally. They can't explain it, but they can do it and they know it. So I think it's important, and it will be increasingly important as our understanding of educational theory matures, that there are several ways of knowing, and you can know something but still struggle to explain it. Declarative involves sequential sorts of tasks. So whereas procedural is more like complicated patterns. Let's say that I'm teaching you Spanish, which I wish I could do. I could do a little better teaching you some Russian, but okay, so I can explain the verb conjugations, right? So yo hablo, tú hablas. So, and I go all the way through those. That's explaining in a sequential sort of way. It's using the declarative system. And a person can learn initially those Spanish conjugations using their declarative system. But when they've practiced a lot with them, they develop their procedural links. And that's when the person begins to speak Spanish fluently, because they have not only those declarative, but also those procedural links. But it works as well for math. In fact, I'll explain that in a moment, but declarative it's very quick to learn. You can learn that Spanish verb conjugation. I mean, quick as learning can be, depending on how fast your brain is. Mine tends to be rather a laggard, but it's much easier and quicker to see a list of Spanish verb conjugations than to sit there and listen to Spanish and try and see if you can figure out what those verb conjugations are, which is what children do when they're learning procedurally as infants and toddlers. Now, procedural learning, as you can see with that example, it can take you a fair bit of practice. But once you've got it into your procedural system, it's really fast to use. So let's say we've got something like this. What is 1 over k? Well, if you're at all into math or STEM, you would look at that and instantly go, oh, that's just k. It simplifies to k. It's because we who work with STEM can do this simple procedural, have a procedural understanding of that equivalence. And it makes it so we can very rapidly see and understand what to do in certain circumstances. So knowing some aspects of math, both declaratively and because you practice procedurally, can make it so that you have a much broader, like 2 legs to stand on with your learning. And it makes it so your learning is really enhanced. Some things you can do really quickly, and then you're not struggling so much on the other kinds of things. Declarative learning is flexible. So you can change that sort of thought pattern more easily. Procedural is rather inflexible. So for example, you can be really fast typing on a keyboard, but if somebody changes the keys on the keyboard, it takes you a while to adjust to what has happened. So these are 2 completely different learning systems, but we need to have students using both systems and building sets of links through both systems in order to help them to be really good learners. So the best way to do declarative learning is to use explanations and do retrieval practice. For procedural learning, so explanation helps with declarative and retrieval practice, of course. For procedural, active practice using interleaving, using spaced repetition, all of these kinds of things can be really helpful. So what I want you to do is, I'm going to go, let's see, if I can, let's see here. I can go over, let's see. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment, and then I'm going to restart my sharing. So what I want you to, oops, before I do that, I want to, let's see, let's see, Alex, is it possible that I can just share a link? Tell me that I can share a link. I hope. Oh, well, golly, I guess, and I was all set up for you so that I could do it, but I will show you what is going on in any case. Let's see here. We've got share screen, and we're going to go over here, and I'm going to share this. And let's see, what have we got here? Okay, so all of these things, if you are able to go to that website, but if you're not, then I'm just here. So you can't explain it or not easily. Which one would that be? Do you have it in your mind? I hope. Let's see. Let's see. We'll put it under declarative. No, of course it's procedural. And you're not conscious of it. That's probably procedural. See, if things were working properly, and this is, of course, what we always have to deal with technology, then you could be doing this also. It's kind of a fun exercise. But it develops through practice. Explicit instruction for is declarative. And of course, you're quite conscious of it. Complex patterns. Got it in mind, involves procedural, and of course that's like typing, inflexible, fast to learn, but slow to use. And so let's see if we can check out or see, come on, where's our check? Oh, we got 100%. Except I'm the teacher, so it doesn't really count. So, okay, so anyway, so I would just like to just remind you to how are you, or ask you, how are you incorporating these kinds of ideas in your day-to-day teaching? Are you allowing for practice? Are you allowing for students to develop sets of links in both areas? Because if they are able to do this, it will really help them with their learning. And of course, I tend to be a big fan of Course Hero, because one of the best ways to easily find more materials for your students to practice with is to use some of the great materials available on Course Hero. So with that, I hope that this has been a useful presentation for you. I will be building out on this in this afternoon's presentation on online learning. So I thank you so very much, and until this afternoon.